Welcome to the Single Point, Episode 4, where we continue our 9 teams in 9 weeks division of the Rouge Radio podcast. And this week we center in on the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. For that we bring in, I guess we can call him the newest draft guru from 3downnation.com and the host of the Blue Bomber Talk podcast, Mr. John Hodge. John, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure, gentlemen.
I was going to start off inquiring about the draft because I liked your insight and how you graded everybody. But then Kyle Walters dropped a big bomb on Friday. So I got to ask, is Chris Mathews the big receiver the Bombers have been looking for in a while?
I'll say yes. I'm going to say yes a little bit cautiously, only because last season, like many people, I thought that Adarius Bowman was going to be the big-bodied receiver that the Bombers needed, that a guy who was going to come in and really round out their receiving core, and that turned out to be a big bust. And there are some parallels between Mathews and Bowman. Both are guys who, had previously played well in Winnipeg, coming home a little bit later in their careers. That said, Mathews is younger. He doesn't have the same mileage. He's a guy who is 29, but has spent much of the last 5 years bouncing around on NFL practice rosters, on reserve lists, came back to the CFL kind of midway through last season as a member of the Stampeders. So I'm interested to see where they play him. I think he could be a guy who plays a lot of wide out at that boundary spot that Darvin Adams normally plays. I think they could put him in the slot in that spot vacated by either Weston Dressler or on the boundary. So I'm cautiously optimistic for the club's sake that he'll be that missing piece. I do think he's obviously younger and more importantly has less mileage than a guy like Bowman. And the thing that I love about it is it's a 3-year commitment, which is great if you're Winnipeg, and they didn't overpay to get him, getting him this late in the process. So I think you look at the signing with cautious optimism if you're a Bomber fan, and if Mathews plays anything like he did as a rookie in 2012, then you certainly got a good one.
So we focus back because this is kind of like the second year. It's kind of like an annual tradition, so to speak, for Kyle Walters to have his biggest free agent signing in May prior to training camp. Is this something that was in the works for a long time, or is this something that just happened to fall into his lap?
Well, come free agency, the Bombers came very close to signing Naaman Roosevelt, the veteran slot back in Saskatchewan. And I think the Bombers got almost essentially as far through the process of signing a player as you can get without actually signing them. They almost had a deal in place as far as agreeing to terms, and eventually the club got cold feet, put a pin in it, and I think a reason for that was they really coveted a guy with a body type like Chris Mathews, and Mathews is 2 years younger than Roosevelt, and Roosevelt has had some history of injury the last couple of years. And so I think, you can say that he fell into their laps for a couple of reasons. One is just how late in the game it is. Chris Mathews was holding up for NFL opportunity. Age 29, that opportunity's not coming along, I don't think, to many players. He's unable to get on a 90-man roster right now, and by the time the season rolls around, NFL teams will be cutting to 53, right? And I don't believe at his age and experience level he has any PR eligibility left. The other thing is teams have already spent their money, right? No one knows exactly what the salary cap's going to be in 2019, but, people spend like crazy in February and kind of deal with those ramifications later. And so there's not a lot of teams with extra money laying around. I think back in February, one of the reasons the Bombers reneged on potentially signing Roosevelt was to then say, hey, we don't know how long it'll be, but if we keep this pile of money and instead give it to Chris Mathews, and Chris Mathews did not get as much as the Bombers were offering him in Roosevelt, then they say, hey, we can get a better, younger player, and we can get him at a better price point. Obviously, there's risk, because if Mathews never signs or if he chooses to go elsewhere, then you're potentially left without anybody. But, to get to roll the dice to get a good receiver under contract for what he's getting, is a coup for the club, and certainly, the risk paying off there for Kyle Walters for the second straight season, adding, an all-star caliber player late in the game.
So I kind of want to switch. Daltz brought up the GM. I want to go to the head coach. It was December 2013. Mike O'Shea gets hired to bring over this football club. Now, this is all due respect to Mike O'Shea, and no way do I imply he hasn't done very well in Winnipeg. But he's had some very good teams there. Over 6 years, is Mike O'Shea still the guy to lead the Winnipeg Blue Bombers? And I don't mean that to open up controversy about whether or not he should be fired. I'm just simply saying some coaches tend to have a shelf life. 6 years is a long time for one head coach to stay in a city. Is Mike O'Shea still kind of the guy to fit in Winnipeg?
I think that's the case without a doubt. Mike O'Shea, I think, has the full respect of essentially everybody in the organization. You know, when Paul LaPolice wanted to interview in Saskatchewan, Mike O'Shea was one of the people who went to bat for Lapo and went to the club bigwigs and said, look, this is a guy who's worked hard for us the last 3 years. He's turned our offense from, you know, a pretty anemic attack to one of the league's best outfits. He deserves the opportunity to interview, and people respond to that kind of thing. People respond to a coach who's always looking for the best opportunity for everyone on the team, be it a player, be it a coach, because, you know, when somebody has your back, even to their own detriment, obviously it would have been a bad thing for the Bombers and for Mike O'Shea had Paul LaPolice left to join a rival, but he still fought for that because it was the right thing. That said, I am interested to see the future of Mike O'Shea in Winnipeg because his contract is up after this year. And I think if you were, let's say, a team in need of a head coach, or say a team that was potentially set to hit the field in a couple of years in Halifax, he would be the perfect fit to establish the new culture of a franchise, just like he did in Winnipeg, as you said, in December of 2013 when he took over the Bombers. So I would absolutely think the club would certainly be best served by keeping O'Shea. Though on top of that, if he does leave, I don't think it'll be because he's been let go. I think it'll be because another team stepped up and said, we want you to be our guy. And the coaching cap limits that potentially because, you know, another team can't come along and necessarily just blow the old contract out of the water and buy a coach. But, you know, I can certainly see why another team would potentially be interested in Mike O'Shea's services.
Well, I mean, it almost came across as Tony wanting to say that Mike O'Shea was on the hot seat, but one of the coaches that is on the hot seat in that crew is Richie Hall, and I don't want to get your opinion or speculation, but more so just in regarding to the turnover, because last year the Bombers' defense, in my opinion, made some tremendous strides, especially in the latter stages of the season. Part of that having to do with Adam Bighill. They were respectable. They were shutting down opponents' offense. They lost some veterans this offseason. What can we expect from Richie Hall's crew, specifically the secondary, because I think that's pretty much where the major turnaround has taken place?
That's an excellent question. I think the Bombers' philosophy, I mean, they shipped off Tony Messick, the old defensive backs coach, before last year, and that's kind of who I think they laid the blame to as far as, you know, struggling to develop some young players in their secondary. This past year, they certainly hit on a young player in Marcus Sales, who started essentially the entire second half of the season at boundary halfback. I think he's certainly guaranteed a starting job. Brandon Alexander, just freshly signed a contract extension. He'll have a starting job. And Anthony Gator, who I think was a bit of a pleasant surprise, a guy who was pretty unceremoniously let go in BC, comes over. I think part of the Ryan Rigmaiden influence there, formerly working in personnel in BC, now in Winnipeg, comes in and he looks good at halfback and strong side linebacker. Now, obviously, the Canadian safety spot will not be filled by Taylor Loeffler this season. Derek Jones, Jeff Hecht, a couple guys with the inside track there. I'm also intrigued to see what Winston Rose does. Winston Rose has 2 seasons under his belt as a starter, albeit at the field side cornerback spot. The other guy who's a bit of a wild card is Chandler Fenner. Chandler Fenner signed a big contract coming over from the Lions last February in 2018. And he's a terrific special teams player, but he was getting paid like a starting Sam, and he did not end up starting a lot of games last year. He got to Winnipeg, and I think they kind of realized he might not be the best fit for Richie Hall's defense. And so looking at the secondary right now, I think you'd pencil in maybe Fenner at Sam, Gator at boundary half, maybe you flip Marcus Sayles to boundary corner, and then your field side is Winston Rose and Brandon Alexander at corner and half respectively. But that said, training camp is going to sort out a lot of things. They got Tyneil Cooper, who's coming back after a couple starts last year, most of the year on the practice roster, and they've got a huge number of rookies who are going to come in and compete for a job, just like Marcus Sayles did last year. Obviously, Chris Randall, the veteran who's moved out. Aside from that, Big E's the undisputed leader of the defense, as you alluded to there, Daltz. And then up front, I think this defensive line is pretty spectacular. The middle will be the same with Brandon Bryant and Drake Nevis. Neither player, I don't think, a world beater, but guys who can be productive in the middle. The Bombers don't ask a ton from their defensive tackles. They essentially ask them to occupy the interior blockers, and Biggie cleans up in the run game. And in the pass game, they've got 3 really good defensive ends, led now by Willie Jefferson, who are going to try to make life miserable for opposing quarterbacks. Jackson Jeffcoat's back, fresh off re-signing, and Craig Rowe is still around. So I think they're going to rely on that defensive line to get pressure. I think Adam Bighill is going to be asked to do Adam Bighill things. And, if Richie Hall deploys the unit pretty similarly to last year, just taking advantage of the improved personnel on the line and can help shade things maybe on the back end a little bit as these young players get more experience, then there's no reason to think this defense won't be strong.
So I think this time my question is going to be a little bit more direct because, honestly, how does Winnipeg handle Strevler and Nichols? 2 good quarterbacks. Everyone's going to always give the right answer. I'm here to play, whether it's Strevler or Nichols. I personally can't see the Bombers carrying these guys for a long time, and they're both going to want to be starters. What does Winnipeg do with this Strevler-Nichols combination in the future or this season?
I think both players showed down the stretch last year that they're willing to give the other guy looks. And I think if you're the Bombers, you want to see Chris Strevler continue to be developed and get playing time, not just sitting on the bench. And with his running ability, I think he provides a great second look. And so I think if you're the Bombers, a perfect world would be both quarterbacks get meaningful playing time every game. And obviously, of course, both hopefully stay healthy over the course of the season. After this year is where things get interesting because both Matt Nichols and Chris Strevler are set to become free agents at the end of the 2019 season. And, Matt Nichols will be I don't have his age in front of me. I want to say he's going to be 33 after the 2019 season going into 2020. He's got some long-term injury issues, both in the past and nicks that he's still dealing with from last year. Chris Strevler is very young, very mobile, and perfectly suited to the Canadian game. If I was the general manager of the team, I know which player I would want to invest in long term. Part of the problem is that Chris Strevler may have some NFL interest in the long term. If you're Winnipeg, I think you try to sell Chris Strevler long term on playing in the CFL, partly because as we saw this past offseason with a guy like Bo Levi Mitchell, going to the NFL just to get cut is maybe not optimal when you can stay in Canada and make a really good living. Now, Chris Strevler's not going to get the $700,000 that Bo Levi Mitchell got or the $725,000 that Mike Riley got, but he could probably get $250,000, $300,000 on a second deal with what these quarterbacks are getting paid now. And should he light it up on those deals as a full-time starter, then the sky's the limit. So I think that this year the club's in a good spot, but obviously decision day comes for 2020 when you certainly can't afford to lose both, but you probably can't afford to keep both either with the salary cap being there. And if you got to pick, to me, I think the choice is pretty clear. No disrespect to Matt Nichols. It's simple math, right? It's simple mileage. It's simply a matter of age. I think you try to invest in Strevler long term, and that's part of the reason why I think you got to keep getting him into games in 2019.
I thought Tony was going to follow up with that one. Google is my friend, by the way. Matt Nichols just turned 32 in March. So if anybody was really, if they cared, yeah, he's 32. Tony, you got to follow up on that one?
Well, I was just he did a great job answering my question. I was just going to say, let's make you the general manager right now, and say Toronto, Saskatchewan, Ottawa calls you in the fall and says, listen, we want one quarterback. You are the general manager. Who are you sending to the Red Blacks? But I think you basically answered the question who you would prefer to send if you were, or talk Ottawa into if you were the GM.
I mean, I don't think I would move out either quarterback mid-season because you need two quarterbacks to win in the CFL. But if you forced my hand and you absolutely, completely, 100% forced me as a hypothetical GM to deal one of the two, and let's say the return was just unbelievable. Say the Drew Willie trade happens again, and somebody just blows you out of the water with a great offer. I would, I'd chip out Matt Nichols, provided I felt Chris Streveler was ready to go. Simply because, again, I feel like Streveler is the best long-term option between the two. Again, no disrespect to Matt Nichols, but Streveler's a guy who could be your franchise quarterback for 10 years potentially. Matt Nichols, a guy who, still while effective, is certainly closer to the end of his career than he is to the beginning.
Let's go back to the draft because I want to pick your brain up because I just loved your reports on the draft, your mock drafts and whatnot. The Bombers had the number 4 and 5 overall pick in the 2019 draft. And out of all 14,605 scenarios, sorry for the Avengers reference, but did they come up with the best two options that were available to them coming out of the first round?
I really love Drew Desjardins, the offensive lineman out of Windsor that the club took at 4th overall. He's a guy who I see maybe not quite as developed as Chung was in 2015, but about as close to, at least in this draft class, as you were going to get to a Suk Chung, a guy who's mean, nasty on the field, chucks defensive tackles, really, really tenacious in the run game. His pass blocking needs polish, and I would argue that's the case for Suk as well, to be quite honest. But that's going to come with time. And the other thing is that, the Bombers, the way that they play on offense, that's all they really need, to be quite honest, from their offensive linemen. They're going to either run the ball or they're going to get the ball out of Matt Nichols' hands in 1.5 seconds. And so, Desjardins is a guy who I think, currently just a guard, doesn't snap yet, but could, I think, develop into potentially a CFL center. So I really like that pick for them. I think it's a great selection. The other pick I thought was interesting. Jonathan Kongbo played at Tennessee, was a starter essentially for 2 seasons, formerly a junior college player. He's got just a ridiculous frame at 6'6", 260, essentially the same size and wingspan of a Willie Jefferson. Now, different style of player. I'm not as high on Kongbo as a lot of people I've spoken with. I've watched not a huge amount of film on Kongbo. I don't have the same access to film as of course pro scouts, but I have watched a couple of full games of him at Tennessee. I don't see him as an elite pass rusher, as a defensive end. I see him as a guy who mostly at Tennessee was asked to play the run, kind of as a weak side defensive end. He's going to have to learn pass rush moves at the pro level. That said, he's a great athlete who would be in the NFL had he not suffered a torn ACL in October. We're not going to see him on the field in the preseason. We're not going to see him on the field come week 1. He's a guy who's saying that he'll be healthy probably late June to early July. That's what he and his agent were telling teams before the draft, and that's what he's since told the Bombers since draft day. So I think if you get the opportunity to add an NFL caliber talent, you do it. But the caveat I would throw in with Kongbo is he might be a player whose game works a little bit better in the American style rather than the CFL. But of course, as with any prospect that I'm not super high on, I would be very happy to be proven wrong. I would love for Jonathan Kongbo to come and in the CFL and be a great caliber Canadian pass rusher, and I'd say that regardless of which team he played for. The athleticism is there, the size is there, the NCAA pedigree is there. I just want to see the proof in the pudding. Come whenever it is, whether it's late June, early July, that he sees the field. A guy probably who's going to start out on special teams and then go from there. But if the Bombers can, carry Kongbo as their Canadian to rotate with those 4 Americans, and if you are a guy who's 6'6", 260 coming off the edge, not many better people to learn from than a Willie Jefferson, then I think the Bombers will have hit it out of the park with their first 2 picks in this year's draft.
Fair enough. Well, one more question before we get your prediction on the Bombers this year. You kind of made mention earlier with the handful of rookies on the defensive side. It just seemed that the handful of veterans outweighed the free agent acquisitions this offseason. So probably my best guess is that there's probably going to be a few rookies here and there starting on that Bomber team, or maybe at least standing out on special teams. So I'll ask you, in your opinion, at this point, what you know now, who's going to be the big standout, the breakthrough player for this year's Winnipeg Blue Bombers squad?
I've not yet, to be completely honest, I haven't yet really dug into a lot of the rookies who the Bombers have signed. I typically do that kind of the week before training camp. I would have keyed in prior to the Chris Mathews signing on a potential impact American receiver. It's no secret that the Bombers have not had a ton of success finding and developing their own American rookie receivers for the last number of years. But the player that everybody seems to be buzzing about is Lucky Whitehead coming out of their most recent camp. He is a receiver, but he is essentially a return specialist. And all the media people who covered the team for the Bombers, including their very own Ed Tate, seem to think he was a big standout. I obviously wasn't there, so I'm not trying to claim that analysis as my own. But Whitehead's a guy who was a full-time return specialist for 2 seasons with the Dallas Cowboys. And so, he has that diminutive kind of body type that you're looking for in a CFL return man. He's ultra quick, and that's obviously a position of need. The Bombers haven't had an impact return man for, a couple of seasons. They looked last year between, Nick Dembski, Ryan Langford. They had Rashawn Simonize back there for a little while. Charles Nelson looked pretty good towards the end of the year, but a lot of time and effort went into rotating returners, and they never found a match. And so if Lucky Whitehead can come in, who just signed this past couple days with the club officially, if he can come in and make a difference, then I think he would be, a nice candidate to hop off the page, simply because, there's not a lot of spots, certainly in the starting lineup, that are going to be up for grabs necessarily for rookie Americans, but that's a return spot that I think the Bombers could really look to improve on, and Whitehead seems to at least have the early buzz heading into training camp, provided it opens on May 19th.
Oh, yeah, the good old CBA possible locking up. But, hey, until it actually someone strikes, or a team, or the management, I guess, locks the players out, I am going to continue business as usual, is my opinion. But, hey, John, before we let you go, how do you think the blue and gold will finish this year in 2019?
Do you want record and spot in the standings, or you just want one or the other?
Hey, both. We always get both. And if you want to give in to the Ryan Ballantyne 18-0 record, by all means, that's completely up to you.
No, and I've had this conversation with Ryan. That 18-0 is ridiculous. Man, that's a good question. Let's start with the West in general, because I don't think you can just give a record without talking a little about the rest of the division. I think BC is going to be a very good team in time. I think they have a great young coaching staff. I think they've made a lot of shrewd moves. Getting Mike Riley, I think regardless of price point, is a pretty shrewd thing if you can get it done. The downside is with the additions they've made that have cost a lot of money. For instance, a guy like Riley, a guy like Suk Chung, there's going to be holes elsewhere in your roster. And right now, I unless they know something I don't with an eggless player they have, I don't like what they have in terms of corners. I think they're thin at linebacker. I'm not sure who else other than Odell Willis is going to rush the passer off the end. The right tackle spot is a question mark. Canadian draftee in 2018, third rounder David Neville, I think, might have the inside track there. And American receivers, they've got Brian Burnham and Jerron Carter, who I think will be great. That third spot is completely 100% wide open. So the Lions, I think, maybe as the season goes on, will get better and better and compete for first. I'm not sure I see them there right now. All due respect to the guys who I think have done great work this offseason. I think Calgary is probably the other team the Bombers need to be concerned about in terms of the chase for first. That said, the Stamps have a ton of holes on their roster. They have some uncertainty at right tackle. They have some uncertainty at certainly along the defensive line where they've lost 2 all-star caliber players. If you want to talk Micah Johnson, you want to talk Jagarrett Davis, now in Saskatchewan and Hamilton respectively. The linebacking core is a complete mess as far as I'm concerned. They started a Canadian there last year, of course, and Alex Singleton. I don't think they're going to be able to do that this year. And the secondary is very thin as well. So I think the Bombers have a chance to finish first. I don't see them finishing any lower than third. I think Edmonton's going to need some time to gel. I think they have a lot of holes still. And Saskatchewan, I think they won a lot of games last year on the strength of Chris Jones' defense. And they're not going to have him to hide the fact that their offense is, I think, going to be terrible again this season, to be quite honest. So if I had to push it, I'll average it out. Let's say the Bombers finish second in the West in terms of record. Let's go with 11-7. Bombers finish 11-7 in 2019, which gives them second in the West, just ahead of either sandwiched between Calgary, BC, in other orders. It's fine with me.
Awesome. I'd love that, to be honest with you. John, you guys haven't recorded a podcast this year. So when do you guys plan on starting, assuming that the season starts on schedule?
That's an excellent question. Tim and I, we typically kind of fire up the pod when the season starts. A lot of our podcast is based on breaking down, previous games, or for example, setting up the next game. And so typically we'll give, probably our first after the first preseason game, though our schedule is pretty informal. We rely on, our social media presence and 3 Down to, make sure people know when the podcasts are going up. But, Tim with his 2 kids and me with things, and a lot of what I do now at 3 Down isn't necessarily Bomber centric. It's moved gradually more and more towards covering the league as a whole. I don't know if we might potentially look at doing a bi-weekly podcast this year instead of a weekly show, but yeah, as long as people stay tuned to 3 Down Nation and stay tuned to my Twitter account at John D. Hodge, then they won't miss an episode of the Blue Bomber Talk podcast.
That's always good to know. Almost kind of like breaking news again, finding out that a host is going to have a bi-weekly podcast. Kind of like breaking news. John, thanks for staying up. I guess it's 10:30 or 11 o'clock. We're in the same Central Standard Time in Manitoba, but it's late regardless, so we definitely appreciate you staying up late to talk football with us.
My pleasure. I hope I didn't sound as sleepy as I feel.
Hey, you know what? On today of all days being Mother's Day, hey, you know what? It's we'll take that for tonight. Thanks again.
Thanks, boys. Anytime.